All right, so the next learning objective is to know what is meant by encoding specificity. So this deals with the final process of memory retrieval, getting information back out. So you have a link here to a video. Again, I encourage you to pause my lecture and watch and take notes on the video on retrieval. You can access it through here or through the Canvas module. There are different types of retrieval we can talk about. One is recall. This means you have to bring the information fully to your conscious awareness again. This is the kind of retrieval you would have to do if you're taking an essay test or a fill in the blank question kind of test. Recognition is the kind of retrieval you have to do if you're being tested with multiple choice. You don't have to, recall everything. You simply have to recognize the correct answer when you see it in front of you. So encoding specificity deals with the context of learning and the context of retrieval. And it refers to the fact that the more the contexts match up, the better the retrieval is going to be. So your book highlights a very interesting study where they had a unique subject pool for this study, scuba divers. So they randomly assigned the scuba divers into different experimental conditions where they were going to learn a list of words and then try to retrieve the list of words. And the different experimental conditions played with the contexts. So in some experimental conditions, the contexts matched up. They learned the words on land, they were tested and made to retrieve the words on land, or they learned the words underwater and were made to retrieve the words underwater. In those conditions, when the contexts matched up, the retrieval was way better. In other experimental conditions, the contexts were mismatched. They learned the words on land and were tested with retrieval underwater, or they learned the words underwater and had to retrieve them under land. And you can see when the context mismatched, they retrieved far worse. This also applies to our emotional state and our state of mind. This is known as state-dependent memory. So if we are in the same emotional or biological state when we learn something as when we retrieve it, our retrieval will be better. So if you're happy when you encode something, you're going to be better able to retrieve it when you're happy. This can explain a lot. This can explain why people who are depressed tend to easily think of other depressing, sad things. That's because of state-dependent memory. They've even had some studies. I don't encourage you to try to replicate this in your own studying, but they found that if you were a little drunk when you studied something, you tested better on that information if you were a little drunk when you got tested on it. So these are examples of what's known as the encoding specificity principle. The encoding specificity principle states that memories are more easily recalled when the context and the cues at the time of encoding are similar to those at the time of retrieval. I have had students in the past who have given me examples of the encoding specificity principle in their own lives, where they have said things like, when I'm studying for a test, I will pop a strong mint like an Altoid in my mouth when I'm studying. And then when I come in for the test, the first thing I do when I sit down for my test is pop an Altoid in my mouth. And they swear that it would help them more easily remember the things that they learned because something was matching up. I had a young lady I remember state that, when she studies and she has to take the exam in class, she knows that when she's taking the exam, she's going to be sitting upright at a desk. She's going to be dressed in her school clothes. She's going to have shoes on her feet. So she says, when I'm studying, even though I'm tempted to get all comfy and lay down on my couch or my bed, I don't do it. I dress like I'm going for school. I even put my shoes on. I sit upright at my desk when I study because that's the way I'm going to be when I'm going to be retrieving this information on the exam. I have an embarrassing personal example of the encoding specificity principle. At my last job where I worked for 21 years, there was a guy by the name of Phil, another school psychologist, that I never worked closely with. We were never in the same department with the same boss, but at least once a week I would see him. I'd also see him at staff meetings and things like that, so I definitely knew who he was. Again, seeing him at least once a week for 21 years. But I had never seen him outside of work. I had never seen him outside of his professional work attire. And then one day, after knowing him for 21 years, I'm with my family in the mall, and he comes up to me, big smile on his face, and saying, "Hey, Paul, nice to see you. This is my wife, so-and-so." And he's like, his wife, "This is Paul. I work with him, and I'm with my family." And I'm like, "And this is," and I'm like, "Oh my God, I can't remember this man's name." I definitely knew who he was by, facial recognition. I knew somebody I worked with, but the fact that I was seeing him out of context and dressed down, I could not remember his name for the life of me. It was so embarrassing. And of course, when you get anxious, then it gets even worse because remembering things takes effort. So I eventually had to bite the bullet and said, "I'm really sorry. I'm having a senior moment here. I can't think of your name. It's embarrassing." And he said, "Phil." And as soon as he said that, it all came back. I knew his last name, who his boss was, could picture the car he drove, everything. But in that first initial moment, because the contexts were not matching up, I could not retrieve his name. So the next thing we're going to talk about are what are some of the other reasons why we forget other than those contexts not matching up. So as an example, let's use this example. This is famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma. He earns his livelihood playing that cello. It's a big, heavy instrument. It is his livelihood. He has it insured for probably like $1 million. One day, after a 10-minute cab ride, he forgot his cello in the trunk. How do you forget something that big, that important, that expensive after just 10 minutes? Well, we're going to see that memory can go wrong at any of those processes in memory, at the encoding, storage, or retrieval phase. And this example with Yo-Yo Ma shows that remembering things takes some effort, and that if you're distracted, if you're not thinking about something, if your attention is elsewhere, you can forget everything. How many of us have left the house without our wallets or our cell phones or something that we use all the time? Um, if your attention isn't on it, you might forget. I literally have seen a student on the phone before and say, hang on, I got to find where my phone is. You're holding it, or, just wait till you're old and you've got your glasses on your head and you're like, where are my glasses? Well, that's because it can happen to any of us. Remembering things takes some effort, and things could go wrong at any of those processes in memory. One of the first persons to study memory in a strategic, scientific way that showed us it takes effort to remember and encode things was Hermann Ebbinghaus. He designed a famous study on memory, and he used himself as the subject of his own study. He wanted to see, what does it take for him to learn and commit to memory something entirely new. So to be sure that what he was learning was something that was entirely new, he made up some nonsense words, nonsense syllables, things that were not real words, and therefore he's ensuring that he would have no prior exposure to those words that could help him. And what he did was, once he came up with this list of nonsense syllables, he kept careful track of how many times he would have to rehearse it until he was able to recall all of the words accurately. And he graphed it out, and he demonstrated some things scientifically that we now sort of take for granted with memory, but he was the first person to give us scientific proof for how we learn and also how we forget. He showed us that we retain more information the more time and the more repetition we go over stuff. And that although he demonstrated it with nonsense syllables, that it's the same concept that applies to you learning meaningful content, like for your college classes. That in order for you to learn something successfully, you would have to spend time and repeat the information over and over. And when our memory fails, it could go wrong at any of the three memory processes: encoding, storage, or retrieval. So some things you don't remember because of encoding failure. That means you never really learned it to begin with. You never got the information into your long-term memory. Sometimes you don't remember because of storage failure. You've learned something, but then maybe you didn't do anything with it in so long that the memory just sort of decayed. Or you could forget something because of retrieval failure. You've learned it, you know you stored it, you just can't get it back out when you need it. Something else is interfering with you recalling the right thing. That was sort of like me running into my old coworker. So encoding failure means your information never got into long-term memory to begin with. And this is because encoding things takes effort. So some examples of failure. Only one of these pennies is the real thing. Can you determine which one it is without pulling out a pocket full of change? Only one of these Apple icons is the real thing. Which one is it? If you struggle with these things that you have seen for a long, long time, why is it? It's because you sort of took it for granted. You never encoded it. You never said to yourself, let me study this penny and know where every thing is and what it says in case I ever have to retrieve it again. So that's an example of encoding failure. To learn something, you got to hold it in your working memory, hold it in your immediate awareness, and process it. Think about it. So if you couldn't remember which icon was the right Apple logo or what was the right penny, that's an example most likely of encoding failure. Now, storage decay is what can go wrong at the storage process. This means you learn something, but then you haven't done anything with it in a long time. This is a graph of a study that I literally could have been a part of. This shows people in a Spanish course and how much Spanish vocabulary they were able to retain after the course ended. So you can see that after the course ended, your retention dropped off. You didn't lose everything, then it leveled off. This was totally me in high school. I had 4 years of Spanish. Senior year, I had AP Spanish, where we were reading Spanish literature books this thick, writing multi-page Spanish essays. I took the AP Spanish test and got a 4 and got 4 college credits for it and placed out of language in college. So I never took another Spanish course, never went anywhere where I had to use it. This was me. Can I read those thick Spanish literature books now or write Spanish essays? Absolutely not. I experienced storage decay. Did I forget everything? No. I could probably still muddle through a basic conversation and, if you dropped me in Mexico, I could probably order a meal and find the bathroom, but certainly can't converse the way I might have senior year of high school. That's an example of storage decay. Now, the final thing that can go wrong is a problem at the retrieval process of memory, retrieval failure. It can be things like my coworker's name being at the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring it back out. That is one example of retrieval failure. Other things that can go wrong at the retrieval process is interference. That means something else gets in the way of you retrieving the right thing. There are 2 different types of interference. The first is known as proactive interference. It is forward acting. That means something you learned before is interfering with your ability to retrieve something accurately that you learned later. So let's consider this example. So you learned your friend's email address while they were away at college. You committed that to memory. You knew that. You stored it. You encoded it. You learned it. And then they were done with college. They got a new email address and you learned that one as well. You are now trying to retrieve this one. And this is the one that keeps coming to mind. This is the one that keeps interfering with your retrieval of the later one. That's an example of proactive interference. Retroactive interference is backward acting. So something you learned newer is interfering with your ability to retrieve something that you learned earlier. So let's say you had to change your password to get into a particular account. You learned your new password, but then for some reason you have to get into an old account where you have to remember the old password, which you know you learned and you know you stored away, but every time you try to think of this one, this is the one that's coming to mind. That is what is known as retroactive interference. So you have this example of the two different types of interference. So studying for two subjects and then being tested on one of them. So if something old is interfering with your retrieval of something newer, then that is proactive interference. If something newer is interfering with your retrieval of something you learned earlier, then that is retroactive interference. The other thing that can go wrong at the retrieval phase is there are just some things maybe you don't want to retrieve, you don't want to think about. Freud would call that repression. Maybe whatever the memory is, it's too upsetting, it's too anxiety provoking, so you're intentionally not trying to think about that. That's something else that could go wrong at the retrieval process. All right, the next objective is to explain how memory is malleable. So one of the easiest ways to demonstrate the malleability, the changeability of memory is by talking about the misinformation effect. This, again, is the work of Elizabeth Loftus, one of the memory researchers you saw in the video at the beginning of this chapter. And she showed participants in a study a depiction of a car accident. And then she randomly split her participants into two groups and asked one group how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, and the other group how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Almost identical. The only thing she's changing is the one word hit for smashed. That little change influenced how people insisted that they remembered the actual accident. Those questioned with the word smashed insisted that they remembered the cars going faster than they really were. They also insisted they remembered things that were not present in the original depiction of the accident, like more damage, like broken glass, none of which was in that actual accident scene, but would be consistent with a higher velocity impact. So one little word can influence how somebody remembers an event. You have a link here to another video on the misinformation effect. One from the National Geographic show Brain Games. I encourage you to pause me and to watch that video to see the misinformation effect in action. All right, so that's one example of how memories are malleable. Now we're going to get into an even more dramatic example, that of what's known as rich false memory. Rich false memory are things that did not really even happen, but the person merely imagines it happens, maybe because something that they have heard and talked about over and over, and they start imagining something that happened that really did not. You have a link here to a video about research on rich false memory, where they convinced over half of the participants in a study that they took a hot air balloon ride as a child when they really didn't. That seems surprising. How could, that's an unusual event. I mean, I don't think a lot of people go on hot air balloon rides. So if you really did go on one, you certainly would remember it. But it shows that we can convince people that something that never happened really did happen. So these kind of examples show us that every time you bring something to mind, it's not like you're hitting the instant replay button. You are reconstructing a memory. And we can get it wrong. So a source memory means knowing when and where the information was acquired. Sometimes, even though we remember the memory, we get it wrong with regards to, well, how do we know that? Sometimes we get the source memory wrong. Sometimes we do source misattribution. We remember the event right, but the details of how we learned that wrong. So for example, you know the capital of Michigan is Lansing. Do you also remember when was the first time you learned that? What elementary school teacher taught you that fact? That is an example of what we talk about as source amnesia, not knowing where did that memory come from. In the real world, there's a lot of sources that we could get wrong. The book highlights some interesting ones during the 2016 elections, and we're coming up on new elections in 2020, so be sure that you vote. But during the 2016 elections, comedians, took full advantage of it and were running skits on Saturday Night Live posing as Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And people started to hear the things said in the skit and misattribute the source. Was that something Donald Trump really did say, or was that something that we heard in the Saturday Night Live skit? That is an example of what we mean by source amnesia. All right, so now we're going to talk about some pretty serious cases of amnesia and the brain structures involved. So we're going to talk about the difference between anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So we're going to start with the story of Henry Molaison when he was still living and case studies were written about him. He was referred to by his initials in the scientific literature, HM. He was a man who had severe epilepsy that was not responding to medications, and he was having repeated seizures, multiple seizures per day. At the age of 27, he underwent some brain surgery with the intention of alleviating the seizures by removing parts of his temporal lobes. But in doing so, they damaged something underneath the temporal lobes, the hippocampus. The hippocampus, as we learned in Chapter 3, is involved in memory. So with a damaged hippocampus, HM was not able to make any new explicit memories from the time of that surgery moving on. And he lived a rather long life. Now, every explicit memory that he had made prior to age 27, he retained. But from the moment of the damage to his hippocampus, because of the surgery on, he could not make any new explicit. So, doctors and nurses and researchers worked with him on a daily basis, and every time he would meet the doctor, it would be, in some respects, as if he was meeting somebody new for the very first time. He would never recall having met them before, would not recall their names. Even his own face. The last explicit memory of what he looked like was what he looked like at age 27. So as he aged and looked at himself in a mirror as an old man, or looked at himself in photographs, he did not even recognize who he was, because the last explicit memory of what he looked like was what he looked like at age 27. Now, other memories, like implicit memories, memories that are made without conscious awareness, procedural memories, all of those kind of things he retained. So studies of HM gave us very vivid evidence that the hippocampus is essential for processing explicit memories, but that implicit memories are clearly processed elsewhere in the brain. So let's refresh our memories with how we categorized different types of long-term memory. So an explicit memory, again, is a memory that is declarative, one that you can put into words and tell somebody about. So facts, knowledge, your own life events, everything prior he could tell you about, but he could not form any new explicit memories from the moment of the surgery on. So no new facts, no new names, no new knowledge was encoded. So remember that explicit memories include two types. So semantic memories, all of your facts and general knowledge, and then episodic memories, your personally experienced life events. So your implicit or non-declarative memories are all of those memories that are more unconscious. These are memories that are processed by other areas of the brain, such as the cerebellum. So for an example, HM learned new procedural skills. He had motor memory. So one of the things that they taught him was mirror drawing. So you would have to look at an image in a mirror and try to copy that image. If you've ever tried to do that, it's a challenging thing to do because you sort of have to consciously tell your hand to do the opposite direction of what it is seeing in the mirror. HM got good at that task, showing that the fact that he got better and better at it, that there was an implicit memory. However, if you were to ask him to put into words, have you ever done this before? Do you remember doing this kind of thing? He would say no, he doesn't remember doing it. Implicit memories include things like your procedural memories. It includes priming. It would involve the unconscious aspects of a memory. So for example, like I said, if he had doctors interacting with him daily, he would not remember those interactions. He would not remember the doctor's names, but implicitly something was retained. If people observed his behavior, what they would see is somebody who clearly was comfortable with that doctor. So some part of his mind was remembering the interaction, even though he could not consciously recall it. So what HM had was an example of anterograde amnesia, the inability to form new memories after a certain date. So here you have pictures of HM at age 27 and HM as an older man before his death. If you were to show HM this picture of himself, he would not know who that was because this was the last explicit memory he made of what he looked like. So you have a couple of video case studies here. So I encourage you to pause my lecture and to watch these videos. One is an example of anterograde amnesia, much like HM, where damage to the hippocampus prevents somebody from making new memories moving forward. The other type of amnesia is known as retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is losing memories prior to a particular date. You're then, if the hippocampus is left intact, able to make more memories moving forward. So you have a video case study here of a man who experienced encephalitis, an inflammation of the cerebral cortex, where he lost all of his memories overnight, including memories of his wife and their marriage of 40 years, because all of the cerebral cortex was inflamed. That's where those memories are stored. Now, deep within the brain, his hippocampus was left intact, so he did have the capacity to develop new memories moving forward. So again, it's important that you're able to make that distinction between what is retrograde amnesia and what is anterograde amnesia. So cases like this have demonstrated to us that the hippocampus, part of the limbic system that is active in stage 2 sleep that you learned about in past chapters, is essential for processing new explicit memories for facts and your life events. But that's not where they are then stored. The hippocampus then feeds those memories to other areas of the brain, namely the connections within the cerebral cortex. Cases like this have also demonstrated that implicit memories are handled by an entirely different area of the brain, namely the cerebellum, that old area of the brain in the back that is responsible for things like nonverbal learning and learning by classical conditioning, which you learned about last chapter. So if you damage the hippocampus, somebody's not going to make any new explicit memories. If you damage the cerebellum, someone will be unable to make new implicit memories. Now, the final objective is to understand what is the neurological basis for memory, and that's what's known as long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation was first studied with a very simple animal, the sea slug. The reason the sea slug was chosen was because even this simple animal could make memories and could learn something. But its brain was far simpler, far fewer neurons, so we could actually more easily see the changes in the brain as a result of learning. So what they did was they taught the sea slug a simple task through classical conditioning. So passing a mild electric current through the water causes a reflex in the sea slug to reflexively withdraw its gills. So they classically condition the sea slug to associate the passage of an electric current through the water with a squirt of water. So they would squirt the sea slug with water, followed by the mild electrical current, which made them withdraw their gills, until eventually you squirt the sea slug with water, and even before the electric current is passed, they would withdraw their gills. That would show evidence that the sea slug has learned. They have learned to anticipate that a squirt of water means a passage of an electrical current is about to come. And then they looked at what went on in the sea slug's brain as a result of that learning. And what they found were that certain neural connections got stronger. And this is what they called long-term potentiation. So when you learn something, long-term potentiation is the neurological basis for that memory. It is what is going on at the level of the synapse. So when you learn something, you are activating genes which form proteins to grow new synaptic connections, to grow more dendrite branches, to grow more receptor sites at the level of the synapse, so that it is easier for those pathways of neurons to communicate with each other. So one way of thinking of it is, there's a saying that neurons which fire together wire together. We know that they don't actually wire, that they're separated by a synapse, but those synapses are more efficient at sending messages to one another. We have other evidence for that because growing new synapses, growing more places for synapses to happen involves proteins. So if we give a drug that blocks the formation of the protein necessary for growing those synaptic connections, then rats won't learn a new task. Whereas if we give a drug that enhances the protein production that is needed to grow those new synaptic connections, then those rats learn that task even better. So if long-term potentiation is pathways of neurons getting more efficient at sending messages to one another, then probably one of the biggest detriments to long-term potentiation is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease disrupts long-term potentiation, and it affects over 5 million Americans. It is a neurodegenerative disease, meaning it's going to get progressively worse. And what happens in Alzheimer's is you start growing things in the brain that don't belong there. Neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques that are results of proteins clumping up and getting in the way of those synapses sending efficient messages to one another. And if now those pathways of neurons can't communicate with one another because there's globs of protein tangling up the neurons, you start losing memory. And that is what happens in Alzheimer's disease. It is a deadly disease where the person's cognitive functioning is going to get more and more impaired until the point where they forget their family, their friends. They even forget things like how to eat, how to swallow. People who die of Alzheimer's very often die of things like malnutrition and dehydration, because in the end stages they can't even remember the point of eating and drinking and how to do it. Another neurodegenerative disease that can interfere with learning and memory and can affect younger people even is CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. A similar thing happens in CTE. You start building up proteins in the brain which will clump up the synapses, except these are caused by mild repeated blows to the head. So we're not talking about, open head injury where actual brain tissue is lacerated or injured or things like that. This is the kind of thing you would find in combat veterans and people who play high impact sports, hockey, football, gymnastics, things like that, soccer. And what happens is every place that somebody gets hit in the head, you start accumulating these tau proteins in the place where that blow happened. And depending on how you were hit, your brain is floating in your skull and cerebral spinal fluid. So if I'm hit here, my brain is going to travel to the other side of my head and collide with the inside of my skull. I might start accumulating proteins on this side of my head, even though the blow came from this direction. So as CTE progresses, you typically start with minor changes in personality. You will see that as the disease progresses and more of those proteins build up, you will start seeing the person's mood change, start seeing them get more impulsive, more easily angered. But then as those proteins continue to build up and interfere more and more with long-term potentiation, you will see the same kind of confusion, memory loss, and ultimately advanced dementia that you would find in a person with Alzheimer's disease. So that wraps up Chapter 7 on memory. I hope you found this helpful. As always, I am here at your disposal to clarify anything or answer any questions that you may have about this chapter.